Today, I'm giving my runner's review of the GoPro Hero Max.
So we are a little bit past the 3 mile mark so far. On the menu for today is just a 2-hour run, taking it nice and easy, trying to keep the heart rate low at around 140 to 145 beats per minute, and the paces are somewhere around 9:40 to 10 minutes per mile, so just cruising along for today. The distance between my mouth and the camera is less than an arm's length away, so relatively close. I just give you an idea of the sound quality without any external mics. We are about an hour and a half into the run. I'm on the way back now. For the most part, I'm generally getting a bit of a tailwind, so that should factor in to some of the audio quality that we're getting here. The main things though that I was concerned about were my prior experience with the GoPro Fusion, and that was also a camera that had just some great images that it could pump out, but the workflow was just absolutely insane. It was impossible to integrate into a fast-moving workflow, and so that was a camera that I ultimately had to kind of abandon. With the Max, I was excited because they went from 2 SD cards to 1, promises that you'd be able to do keyframing in the app, all these other things that were going to make the workflow better. And so I was really nervous about it because frankly I just didn't believe that it could get much easier, at least compared to what the workflow was before. Now, I've been working a lot with the Insta360, and that workflow is just really great. I can definitely live with that. I can deal with that kind of workflow on a daily basis, and I was hoping for something similar. And so far from what I've seen, it's good news that it is very much similar. Working with the app, it's just miles apart from what it was trying to deal with the GoPro Fusion and the app, and I'm able to get stuff from the camera up into like an Instagram story really quickly and really easily. That's nice. The downsides of this camera though are the frame rate. So this is shooting at 5K between the 2 cameras at 30 frames per second. The only option that I have is 30 frames per second. Now, the interesting thing is when I first got the camera and opened it up, I looked at some of the menus, and 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second were available as an option. When I clicked on 60, it said it would have to reduce the image quality to 3K for the 2 cameras, but it would be available in an update, not yet. I took the firmware update, and the only thing the firmware update did was remove that 60 option from the menus. So now only 5K, 30 frames per second is what's available as far as shooting in 360.
13.11 miles, 90 minutes, 36 seconds per mile, at a heart rate of 145 beats per minute on average. Getting out there along the lakefront, beautiful sunlight that we had out there today. A little bit chilly, but otherwise, nothing that's gonna stop me from having an absolutely great time filming today with the GoPro Hero Max. Now, before I get into my detailed thoughts on this camera. I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a camera that I purchased with my own money. No one sent this camera to me. No one's paying me to make this video, and no one's going to get a chance to preview any of this footage before you guys get the chance to see this video on YouTube. Now with that disclosure out of the way, let's talk about the GoPro Hero Max. Now before we get to the Max though, I think we need to talk about some of the other GoPro Hero cameras or the GoPro cameras that are out there. I've shot with the GoPro Fusion before in the past, and I just thought that it made for some beautiful footage, but the workflow was just absolutely unworkable. I just couldn't live with it. Everything just took too long to work with. There were multiple stages of processing, and it just didn't work for any sort of quick workflow or any workflow at all. I just don't know how people worked with it on a regular basis. I certainly couldn't. It was just too frustrating, and there were other limitations that we still kind of see in the Max that I'll talk about soon, but that were there with it that made me not really want to go with it. My favorite 360 camera is the Insta360 1X, and its workflow is much easier to work with. It still takes a lot more time, probably twice as much time to work with as it does with, say, regular GoPro footage, because you have to not only capture the footage, but you're also then afterwards in post selecting what the viewer is going to look at least in the way that I like to use 360 footage. And so there's keyframing involved where you have to kind of make those selections and control the camera's movements in terms of what the viewer gets to see. And that's the part that took really long for the GoPro Fusion to take care of, but it doesn't take all that long for the Insta360 1X to do, and that's where kind of my barometer is. As long as the GoPro Hero Max could be anywhere near as easy to work with as the Insta360 1X, I think it would have been a success. The other nice thing about the Insta360 1X is that even though it doesn't have as good image quality because it has to bump the image quality down to 3K, it can shoot at 100 frames per second. The other camera that I typically shoot frequently with is the GoPro Hero. This is the GoPro Hero 8. I've been shooting with a variety of different GoPros over the years. The GoPro Hero 8, pretty fantastic. I really love what they've done in terms of the latest upgrades from even just the 7 that I purchased last year. And so these are the cameras, kind of my breadth of experience in terms of the running footage that I'm trying to capture. Now, going into using the GoPro Hero Max, I normally try to kind of avoid all other people's reviews or other people's thoughts on cameras and gear, so that way when I take a look at it, I'm not tainted by what other people have thought, liked, or didn't like. But for this one, I didn't do that because I was originally going to pass. The workflow experience with the GoPro Fusion was just so horrendous that I felt like I was burned, and I just didn't want to reopen that scar. And then once I did that, and I thought that, I looked at DC Rainmaker's videos, or one of his many videos about the Hero Max, and he was talking about how GoPro seems to be positioning this as like a super GoPro, so not just a GoPro Hero 8, but a GoPro Hero 8 with like a second lens on the back. And he said that really wasn't true, and he said look at the specs to kind of confirm that. And so that had me thinking, all right, DC Rainmaker doesn't think this is all that great. Lots of other people that I follow in the 360 camera world are lackluster on the Max, so I'm gonna let it go. But then one of my friends, Jeremy, who is a great videographer and shoots with lots of different kinds of cameras, was posting Instagram stories from his GoPro Hero Max, and they looked absolutely amazing. So I hit him up and was asking him, like, what's the workflow like? Because that was the biggest thing that was my concern from the Fusion to the Max, was what's the workflow like? Can I live with it? And so he told me that it seemed to be much better because he's had experience with both the Fusion and the Max as well. So based on his content that he was getting, some of the keyframing work that he was clearly doing for some of the videos and Instagram stories that he was making, I thought were just absolutely beautiful. And so I thought that, all right, let's give it a try. But there's 3 main reasons why I wouldn't recommend getting this camera, at least not yet. The main thing is the workflow. So while the workflow is vastly improved, it's much more like the Insta360 1X's. In essence, the process are the same. The steps are the same. The GoPro Hero Max is down to 1 SD card now, so you're not doing that separate stitching step first with the 2 different SD cards and then trying to put it into your video editing software. in the GoPro software that you can use, I use a MacBook. You can look at the footage directly, keyframe and trim edges and trim smaller clips however you want, and export into a 1080 video all from the same time. So it's kind of one pass through in terms of the workflow. So it's much improved. It still takes a lot longer than I would like. I think part of that is because I'm dealing with files that are almost twice as big as what I normally work with. With the Insta360 One X, I'm working with 3K files. With this, I'm working with 5K files. And so that could be part of it. But because the files are so much bigger, it's bogging down my computer. And like I said, I have a MacBook, but my MacBook, while it is a couple years old, it has a Core i7 processor in it, 16 gigs of RAM. But on the other hand, that Core i7 processor is a 1.4 gigahertz processor, and it's using onboard graphics, so I'm not sure exactly what's the horsepower driving the GoPro software. I'm guessing that it's more processor based versus graphics card based, but still, even though it's a Core i7 in that MacBook, I just think that it's a little bit underpowered. I do have some like gaming laptops at work that I could play around with and test kind of render speeds with. I'm not really interested in that kind of thing because my workflow is I want to be light and nimble, and I want to be able to do things on my MacBook or some other laptop that is similarly small and has good battery life, because sometimes I'm not at home and I need to be able to edit from other places. The other thing is, if I leave the MacBook, then I'm back in Adobe Premiere, at least as far as the software that I'm familiar with or have access to, and I just don't really want to be in Premiere, at least not for my daily workflow kind of things. It's just not my preference. So there's speed in the workflow problems still in terms of like rendering. The other thing is, before I even get to render in the keyframing process, the keyframing is great. It works fantastically. Everything that I could ask for and more. It's more intuitive to use the keyframing there than even the Insta360 Studio app. But because it's just bogging down my computer, the playback experience isn't great. And so like I'm getting, when I'm playing it back, like one frame every 2 or 3 seconds in the playback. So it's really jittery, and I find that getting really fine-tuned keyframing is really hard for me to do. Again, it's probably my own fault with my computer being a little bit underpowered for what I'm trying to do with 360 footage. But it's a problem that I don't have with the Insta360 One X. So just putting that out there as a point of comparison. Now, the bigger problem though for me is that the frame rates are limited on this device. And so with the GoPro Fusion, if I remember correctly, I could get up to 60 frames per second in 360 capture. With this, it only goes to 30. And like I mentioned during the video, there was a point where it looked like 60 was an option, and then it looks like in the firmware update they removed it. I'm guessing because they've realized that they're either not going to be able to push out that update, or they don't want people out of the box thinking, oh, this thing is limited or not somehow finished as a product. Whatever the reason is, it only can shoot up to 30 frames per second. And for me, as a runner, in my style of shooting, I love high frame rates. In my GoPro Hero 8 and all my GoPros that could shoot 120 frames per second at 1080, I always shoot at 120 frames per second. I absolutely love that, so that way I could slow it down and get some nice slow motion. With the Insta360 One X, I could get to 100 frames per second and slow that down into slow motion as well, and I just love the look of that. With the Hero Max, I'm only at 30 frames per second, and I just think it's not as interesting, it's not as compelling. The stabilization on this camera is great, but it just isn't as great when it's at regular speed. If I were able to slow that down, even from 60 frames a second to 50% playback, that I think would help in terms of the quality of and the caliber of the footage that I feel like I'm getting out of it. I think that if I could get to 100 frames per second, even if I have to bump down on resolution, that is a trade-off that I'd take any day. So that's really frustrating. And the other thing is, if it's gonna be like the GoPro to rule them all, it has to at least shoot 1080 at 120. This thing can't. It could shoot 720 at 120 frames per second, but who wants to use that? So the 1080 footage is limited to 60 frames per second, and that's just a maddening decision. I don't know why they would have picked that. So for me, I feel like if I wanted to shoot with this, I will still have to carry this around. And while this is certainly still lighter the Max is still certainly lighter than the Fusion, and it's probably so much lighter that I could, carrying both of these is probably the same weight as carrying just the Fusion. What's the point of making it lighter if I still have to carry a regular GoPro with me too? Now you might say, okay, well, I don't need 120 frames per second. 60 frames per second is fine for me in terms of using it in hero mode, which is what they call when you're only using one out of the two cameras. But the problem with that is my third major issue with this camera, which is the user experience, or like the ease at which I can make mistakes with this camera. The main thing is, for me, is that friggin' time lapse. I hate time lapse. And when you hit the button on the GoPro, there's like a quick on feature, so you don't have to leave it on the whole time. You just hit the button when you want to turn it on, and it'll start recording in the last used setting. So whether you were taking a photo or a video, and whatever those video settings were at, if you hit the power button from an off state and you have quick on or quick capture, I forget what it's called, it should start recording in that same last used configuration. There are so many times where I have done that and it has turned on time lapse. I don't want time lapse. There was an intro to this video that I had shot talking to this camera that I lost because it got shot as a time lapse. That is just so frustrating. And I've been shooting with this camera for over a week, maybe even a couple of weeks at this point. And it's something that hasn't gone away with getting used to the buttons or getting used to the cameras. And so sometimes I thought, well, you know what? I think I remember in other GoPros that if you like tapped the on button once or tapped the capture button one time, it would give you like the default, whatever you used last for quick capture. And then if you like tapped it twice or like long pressed it or something, it would give you something different. And I thought maybe that's what I was doing. But then what was weird about that is that if I captured a time lapse or accidentally captured a time lapse, then went to turn on the camera, it turned on in time lapse mode, which tells me that it is somehow, no matter what else I'm shooting at, there's something going on. It's probably user experience, it's probably user error, but there's something going on that makes it really easy even when you never want to shoot a time lapse, to shoot time lapses. And so that is just so frustrating. And so I'm at the point where I'm ready to sell this camera and get rid of it, except for the fact that there was at one point that little 60 frames per second label. I love the video. I love the quality of the video that I'm getting from this camera. I think it's absolutely beautiful. If I could just get it at a frame rate that was something that I like to work with, I think it'd be worth holding on to. Not something I use every day, but something I might use once a week on a big weekend long run, or if I'm going on a trip and I'm running through trails, something like that. That's something then I might reach for the GoPro Hero Max. But it's not something today that I want to use really at all. It's not something today that I want to use on a regular basis. And so that's where I stand with the GoPro Hero Max as of today. We'll see if that changes at all at any point. Overall, I'm not surprised with kind of where we're at with this device, but I am pretty disappointed. So I wish this video could have been real stellar. I wish this product could have been like everything that I've been asking for, because the other thing is, this is my third one of these Insta360 One X cameras, because it's not waterproof or splash proof at all, and I just keep getting it wet. This one is. So I was like really hoping that this was going to solve it and just be the camera to rule all cameras for me, because it is so light and the image quality is really good, but ultimately it falls short. So that's all I have to say about the GoPro Hero Max. Let me know in the comments if you have any other questions or concerns. Before I go, I do want to talk about the charity runner for this week. This week it's Jennifer Robbins, who's running the Rock and Roll Las Vegas Half Marathon in honor of her mother, and she's doing it to raise money for Child Lifeline, an organization that helps sick kids and their families. I was happy to donate $70 to her fundraising efforts, and I'll post a link in the description in case you'd like to learn more. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Yo, what's going on?